Good evening and welcome to Crescent Research Center's expert interview series. Today we will discuss the evolving security landscape of the Strait of Hormuz. And it is my pleasure to introduce our today's distinguished guest, Mr. Klaus Larres. Mr. Larres is Professor of History and International Affairs at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, US. Thank you for joining us, Professor.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you for asking me.
Well, we could move on with our first question. Given the current tensions and partial disruption of shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, how do you assess the likelihood of a coordinated transatlantic response between the US and European allies? And what constraints might prevent a unified strategy?
Well, to be honest, it is quite difficult to imagine that there will be a joint transatlantic approach towards resolving the crisis. As you know, President Trump, together with Israel, started bombarding Iran on the 28th of February, and none of the allies, none of the NATO allies, none of the European allies were informed about it or even consulted about it. They were actually very surprised, had warned against it, were not in favor of doing so. They preferred a negotiated solution with Iran to resolve various issues, the nuclear issues, the ballistic issue, missile, maybe the support of Iran for their proxies in the Middle East, like the Houthis and the Hezbollah and Hamas. But all that they also saw as a problem, but a problem which needed to be talked about and resolved by negotiations, not by war. And when Trump and Israel started bombarding, the Europeans distanced themselves kind of automatically, almost immediately, and said, this is not our war. We would not have agreed to that. And ever since, Trump has been even more critical of the European allies, of the NATO allies, than he was already. And the distance between the transatlantic allies has only grown. There's now a big gap, a big rift between them. So I cannot see a transatlantic joint approach. What the Europeans have said is once the war is over, they are happy to try to make sure that the Straits of Hormuz can be freely transitioned again. And then they are happy to get involved also with getting rid of sea mines in the Straits of Hormuz and other activities. But as long as the war continues, that is unlikely to be the case. At the moment, as you know, we have a ceasefire, but still for the Europeans, the ceasefire is just an interruption of the war. For them, the war has not finished. Therefore, they are unlikely to get involved anytime soon.
That's very interesting. Thank you for the answer. And moving on to the second question. Well, Iran appears to be exercising the so-called selective control over the strait rather than fully closing it. What does this tell us about Tehran's broader strategic objectives and how does it challenge the existing norms of international law and order?
Yeah, let me be clear that impeding traffic through the Straits of Hormuz is not a good idea, is illegal under international law because it's international waterway and no country in the world should be able to tell any other country you cannot go through that straits with your tankers and other ships. However, from an Iranian point of view, it makes, of course, perfect sense to stop traffic through the Straits of Hormuz in order to have leverage over the United States, Israel, and of course the wider world by indirectly producing an energy crisis, as no oil and gas is flowing through the Straits of Hormuz. So from a tactical, strategic, a selfish Iranian point of view, it makes perfect sense to stop oil going through. And that has, of course, increased pressure on President Trump, international pressure, but also domestic pressure, because the oil prices have been increasing, gas prices have been increasing, inflation has taken off, the stock market has stumbled. All that is, of course, to the advantage of Iran. Now the United States has also stopped ships going through the Straits of Hormuz. They have issued a counter blockade. Now also Iranian ships, which of course the Iranians themselves let get through, Iranian ships which usually go to China because China obtains or 90% of Iran's oil goes to China. Many of these ships, or actually virtually all of these ships, now because of the American counter blockade, cannot go through anymore. So the Americans are now putting pressure on Iran and cutting off their resources, their financial resources. From an American point of view, this is perfectly sensible, and because now they have also got some leverage over Iran. So when you look at it from both sides and under war perspectives, both sides have issued a sensible policy within that war context. However, when you look at it from an international point of view, from a legal point of view, then this is not a good idea, because in the end, it means international law, like the free passage of ships through the Straits of Hormuz, is violated from both sides. And secondly, no oil is flowing through the Straits of Hormuz, meaning this increases even the international energy crisis. And while prices have gone up in the Western world, in the so-called global South, in the poorer countries of this world, not just prices have gone up, but also there is a scarcity of oil. They can't get enough oil and gas anymore. And that means that many poor people are suffering. They are not just paying high prices, but they also can't even get the oil. And that means, and not just oil, also fertilizer, helium, and many crucial materials which particularly poorer countries need to keep their agriculture and their economy afloat. So the whole war is proving to be a great tragedy for the entire world, for both the Western developed world and even more so for the poorer global South developing countries.
Thank you, Mr. Larres. That's very insightful. And moving on to the final third question. Do you see the current situation in the Strait of Hormuz as a temporary crisis or the beginning of a longer-term shift towards contested global choke points? And what would that mean for energy security and the great power competition?
Well, it has to be a temporary crisis, because otherwise the world economy would really collapse. What I've just pointed out about the scarcity and the rising prices of oil and gas and fertilizers and so on, if that continued for any length of time, this would have a devastating aspect and devastating consequences for all countries in the world. And everyone knows that. So it needs to be and will be a temporary crisis. What temporary means, of course, is very much the question. The war is almost continuing for 2 months already. So will that be another 2 months? Will it be just 1 month? We don't know. Listening to President Trump, he says the war is about to end. But he has said that before, and the war continued very much as it has done for the last 2 months. So we don't know. I would say at least a few weeks, perhaps even more than a month or two, that situation will continue. And even if the war were finished tomorrow and oil started flowing through the Straits of Hormuz, these tankers will not immediately arrive. They need quite a few weeks to arrive in their destination ports. So the oil and energy crisis we see at the moment, even if the war were finished tomorrow, would continue for quite some time, at least a few weeks. Having said all that it is really in the end probably a temporary crisis, maybe a long temporary crisis, still Iran and other countries have of course now learned what leverage they have over a country, over a superpower like the United States. And that lesson they will not forget. So they will be much more readily resort to similar practices in the future. Whenever there's another international crisis, then Iran or similar countries will resort to that sort of policy of blackmail and pressure and leverage against much more powerful, much bigger countries. And that, I think, will stay with us. So the lesson from the Iran war, in my view, is not a good and it's not a positive one. It has made the world even more complex, more complicated, and more difficult to navigate. So in my view, President Trump should never have started this war. It is an unnecessary war, but now it has started. We, of course, have to try to resolve it as quickly as possible, and perhaps manage to contain the consequences and the lessons from that terrible war as much as we possibly can. But it will be a very difficult task. And here the diplomats all over the world, not just in the United States and Iran, but also among mediating countries like Pakistan and many other countries, the Gulf states in particular, the diplomats really need to do their job and become very skillful at resolving very complex and difficult problems.
Well, that's a lot of food for thought. Thank you, Professor, and thank you for your time and valuable insights. We truly appreciate your thoughtful perspective on these complex issues, and we hope to see you soon again in the future for our future series. And to our audience, I would like to thank you for joining Crescent Research Center's expert interview series. Stay with us for more interesting discussions. Thank you and goodbye.